Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with apple dumplings. That's right, I am very excited to be showing you one of America's oldest desserts, which I love everything about except the name. Since when I think of dumplings, I don't think of something like this. Okay, what this really should be called is baked whole apple pie ball. But anyway, it's too late to change the name now, so we will just stick with apple dumplings. And to get started, the first thing we're going to do is make a very simple sauce. As in 3 ingredients simple. And those will be some brown sugar, some butter, and a splash of nice cold fresh water. And what we'll do is bring that up to a boil, stirring occasionally over medium-high heat. And the reason I'm using a ladle is that eventually this stuff's going to get ladled over our apples before they go in the oven. But anyway, like I said, we'll go ahead and bring that up to a boil. And as soon as that's boiling, and we're sure all that sugar's been dissolved, we can go ahead and turn off the heat and reserve it until needed. And as I carefully swirl this around, I can see that my sauce is clear and there's no sugar at the bottom. So we'll simply turn that off, and that is now ready to ladle over our apples. And then once that's set, we can move on to make a little bit of cinnamon sugar, which not surprisingly is made by stirring some cinnamon into sugar. Oh, and by the way, as I stir this, let me ask you, when was the last time you had a nice piece of cinnamon toast? That was one of my favorite things ever. And then once that's mixed, we can move on to prep our apples. And by prep, I simply mean core, which is super easy to do if you have one of these apple corers. But if you don't, you can do the same thing with a small, thin, pointy knife. Just be careful. Oh, and as far as the apple varieties go, personally, I think a Honeycrisp apple works best for this, but something like a Granny Smith would also work beautifully. So that choice is going to be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the king of your apple dumpling. And as long as your Highness chooses a baking variety, this is going to work fine. And then besides coring this, we'll also want to check for little stickers, since that is not something you want to bake into your apple dumpling. And that's it. Once our apples are prepped, we can move on to rolling out some pie dough. And what I have here is half a batch of our buttercrust dough, which I've divided in half since we're doing 2. Okay, so if you're keeping score at home, 1 full batch of buttercrust should give you enough dough to make 4 of these apple dumplings. And then what we'll do is form that into a disc, and then using just enough flour so it doesn't stick, we will roll that out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, which is going to make it about 7 inches across. But forget that measurement. The bottom line here is we need enough dough to wrap our apple completely. So depending on the size of your apple, you might have to adjust. And sure, I was kind of sort of trying to get it round, which I really didn't. Not even close. But it really doesn't matter, as long as we're able to wrap our apple. And then what we'll do once our pie dough is rolled out is place our apple right in the center. And then we will take our cinnamon sugar, and we'll go ahead and spoon in about 3 teaspoons or so. And then once that's been transferred in, we'll go ahead and plug that hole with a nice chunk of butter. Or as my British friends call it, a knob of butter, which is never not amusing. And then once our apple's been cinnamon sugared and buttered, we will go ahead and bring up our sides of dough, wrapping that as evenly as we can. And one huge tip here, make sure you're doing this with enough dough. Okay, we do not want to stretch and pull this dough too tight. Otherwise, once it bakes, it's going to contract and fall apart. So no excessive pulling and stretching, please. And wherever that dough pleats and we have extra, what we'll do is just simply press that with our palms to kind of even it out, so that one area isn't super thick and another area isn't super thin. And if everything goes according to plan, we're going to have enough to seal everything at the top by simply pressing it all together like you see me doing here. And if we do end up with a little excess on the top, we will simply trim that off and then use that if we want for one optional step. And that would be to roll those trimmings out nice and thin and make a few leaves with which to decorate our dumpling. I mean, do you want an undecorated dumpling? I don't. So I went ahead and rolled that out nice and thin, and then used my knife to cut out 3 leaf shapes, or at least something remotely close to a leaf. And then using the edge of our knife, we can make one line in the middle. And then on either side of that, we'll make some little lines, like at a 45-degree angle, to give it that classic leaf look. And by the way, we're just making marks. Do not cut all the way through. And that's it. To attach these, we'll just brush or rub a little bit of water on the surface, and those leaves are going to stick on nicely. So I did 3 leaves all together, and then I made a little depression in the center, since I still had enough dough left over to make a stem. Oh, and one more tip for you. Do not spend too much time on this stem. Okay, since once these bake, it ends up being virtually unidentifiable. But anyway, once you're happy with your design, we can go ahead and transfer that into a lightly buttered baking dish. And then I really wish I would have taken my own advice. and not worried about the stem, because I wasn't really happy with how it looked, so I pulled it out and reshaped it, and made it much, much worse. But anyway, moving along, I went ahead and made one more dumpling, and as you can see, I spent a little more time on the leaves. And then what we'll do once all our dumplings have been placed in the dish is go ahead and ladle over our sauce, making sure the surface of each dumpling is completely coated. And yes, it might seem like that sauce is a little thin, but that's okay, because that's going to thicken up as this bakes. So we don't want to start off with it thick. And that's it, once sauced, these are ready to transfer into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 50 to 60 minutes, or until our pastry is cooked and beautifully browned and our apples are tender. And while those are baking, it is not a bad idea to give them a couple bastings with the sauce, which I'm doing here after about a half hour. And by the way, feel free to do this while they're in the oven. All right, just open the door and pull out the rack and give them a quick baste and pop them back in. Okay, I'm just doing them here on the table because it's easier to film. But the point is, you're going to want to baste these a couple times while they bake. But anyway, basting aside, like I said, we'll bake these for about an hour total. Or until they look like this. Actually, let me rephrase that. Or until one of them looks like this. So yes, as you can see, one of these completely exploded. And that's because of one reason, and one reason only. It's because I didn't have quite enough dough. So when I wrapped that one, I pulled and stretched it too tight. So this is what we call in the recipe video business a teaching moment. But regardless of their appearance, once these come out, we'll ladle over some more of that sauce, which is going to make that crust even shinier and more beautiful. Unless, of course, it exploded like mine. So anyway, that was unfortunate. And what made me feel even worse is the one on the right was the one I made for Michelle. So that was a bummer. But anyway, on the bright side, mine was fine. So I went ahead and plated it up while it was still warm. And you should have plenty of that sauce, so we'll be sure to spoon some more over. And then I highly recommend this gets served with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. Oh, and I should mention, this is one of the few rare dishes I know that we serve with a spoon and a steak knife. But anyway, once that was properly garnished, I grabbed that spoon and knife and went in for the official taste. And catastrophic ruptures to the other one aside, this really is an amazing thing to eat. Right, the flavor profile is almost identical to an apple pie, but instead of having a bunch of slices of apple, we have one beautifully roasted, tender, sweet apple inside, which, while covered in the same crust we use for a pie, is far superior because we basted it and baked it with that sugar sauce. So you know on a regular pie, those edges of the crust that get soaked with those syrupy juices, and they're extra sticky and crunchy and caramelized and amazing? That's what all this crust is like. Oh, and by the way, a whole apple is a big portion, so I think you can easily serve 2 people from one dumpling. So I'm just going to go ahead and eat half of this, and then I'll save the rest for Michelle, since that one I made for her didn't work out. And of course, I'm half kidding here about giving her half. I didn't film it, but if you transferred that exploded apple into a bowl, and then just simply placed those pieces of fractured crust over the top, and put a scoop of ice cream next to it, you really would be experiencing pretty much the same thing, just in a much, much more unattractive form. So use plenty of dough, and do not stretch and pull it too thin. But anyway, that's it, what they call apple dumplings, even though what they really should call these is whole-baked apple pie balls. But no matter what you call them, they're truly amazing, which is why I really do hope you give them a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.